Hello, and welcome to the Riskonnect podcast, where you can find expert advice, practical tips, and useful information about managing risk and compliance. Your host today is Andrea Brody, Chief Marketing Officer at Riskonnect.
Hi, welcome to the Riskonnect podcast. My name is Andrea Brody, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Riskonnect. And here to join me is Jason Mefford, who is a risk expert. In a minute, I'll have Jason introduce himself, but the topic of this podcast is think you understand risk, think again. There's definitely some common misunderstandings about risk. We all define risk and understand risk in the same way. We should mitigate all risk. There's only one kind of risk, and risk management adds value to the organization. So hopefully those things give you a little bit of things to think about, but we're going to go through those facets of what we seem to see as misunderstandings in the risk professional world. So before we get started, Jason, I'd love it for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so thank you for saying I'm an expert. I hope I hope that I am. I've spent my career in a lot of different places. Being an executive in organizations, responsible for audit, for risk management, ethics, and compliance, and actually spent a lot of time helping to kind of develop the GRC space as well, right? How we kind of pull all of these things together. So I've seen risk from lots of different avenues, right? So from being a consultant helping companies manage risk, but also being an executive who was responsible for risk. And like I said, I think there's some interesting kind of misconceptions, and hopefully that's kind of what we can talk about today is, like you said, those four things that you listed. I think probably all the risk professionals listening would say, oh yeah, that's totally right. But when you talk to others in the organization, or you see that they have issues communicating with others, maybe not everybody believes those things, or those are not as true as everybody really thinks they are. So I think that's kind of why we're talking, right, is to maybe dispel some of the myths, or even kind of explain why, yeah, it's true, but there's some of these other things that you should probably be considering or thinking about as well.
Great, then let's get right into it. So the first common misunderstanding is we all define and understand risk in the same way. Mm-hmm. Risk professionals see risk in their own lens. They seem to misunderstand each other. They're not collaborating. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because there's some different risk management standards or other things that are out there, right? And in one of the things that I see is that there is this definition difference. So maybe let me just kind of explain a couple of the definitions. And I think this is one where, ISO 31000 is one of the standards that's out there about risk management that a lot of people refer to. And they define risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And so I think what happens is, because they're only talking about the effect, not about negative or positive effect, but only on effect, they tend to start using the word risk to mean upside and downside. So the good things and the bad things. And while I understand kind of the basis for why they came up with that definition, I think it confuses a lot of people. Because normally when we talk about risk is a bad thing, right? So if you think about, and risk is an interesting thing, because, here I refer back to some of the notes here that I've made on this, right? That risk can be used as a noun, it can be used as a verb, it can be used as an adverb and as an adjective. And so, most people, when they think about risk as a noun, it's like a situation involving exposure to danger, right? So something like, don't use the stove inside the tent because of the risk of fire, right? That's a way that some people will use it as a noun. but they might use it as a verb, meaning that we're exposed to some sort of danger or harm or loss, like, he risked his life to save his dog. Okay. And so most people, and you hear people outside of risk management using the word risk all the time, but it's always used in a negative context. And so I think as risk professionals, when we try to start using the word risk to also mean good things, it confuses people. And so one of my suggestions is, use risk to mean the downside, but use the word reward to mean the upside, because it's all about risk reward trade-off. I'm willing to accept a certain level of risk in order to achieve some reward that I want to have. And I
So
think that,
how do you get an organization to change the way they think about risk? Because like we said, almost everyone in the organization has a responsibility to manage risk in their own, their own department. How do you change a company to look at it that way?
well, and this is where I think it's kind of interesting, and some of the people listening might not want to hear this answer. I think instead of trying to change the organization to use the word risk like risk professionals want to use it, just change the way that you're actually using it. Right. I know ISO 31000 says this one thing, but it's going to be a Herculean task to try to convince everybody else in the organization that 500 years of economic theory and talking about risk and reward, that's not how we talk about risk now. That's not going to go over very well with most people. And so that's why I usually like thinking about, risk and reward are the effect or impact. It's usually something that you can calculate. Now, what gives rise to risks and rewards? Opportunities and threats. And again, those are words that people are used to using. So if you say, hey, we have an opportunity to do this, right? Then the impact of that opportunity is the expected reward. But there are these things that are threatening us being able to achieve those opportunities. Those are the risks, right? And then you can start to have that intelligent conversation of, okay, I'm willing to risk this much in order to get this kind of a return, right? So I think it's more incumbent upon the risk professionals to learn the language everybody else is using and adapt to that instead of trying to convince everybody to use it differently.
That's great advice.
Yeah, because I think I see people, they just get frustrated all the time because of that. They're like, no, you don't get it. And it's like, well, maybe we're the ones that don't get it.
Absolutely. It's got to start with looking in the mirror, right?
Yeah.
That's what they say.
Yep, exactly.
Yep. Okay. Should we go on to the next one?
Yeah. So well, actually, there were a couple other things I was going to bring up about that too, if you want to, because I think not only in the definition, but even in some of the other terms that we use. And so if you just use the word risk by itself, right, it's not as descriptive as if we use it with some other words. And so here's an example: inherent risk versus residual risk. And so again, most risk professionals or people in this space, we talk about that, right? You have an inherent risk, which is without controls, natural risk, whatever you want to call it. Then you put controls in place or other mitigating activities, and that leaves this residual left over. It's the amount of risk that we have chosen not to manage further. And so I think what ends up happening, because as spending a lot of my career in audit, I used to have this discussion all the time, right? And so we'd call up somebody and we'd say, hey, we're going to come audit your area. And they're like, okay, why are you doing that? Well, because this area is a risky area. It's a high risk area. And the manager almost inevitably responds back, no, it's not. It's low risk. Okay. And so at that point, then you have to kind of stop and say, well, now just a minute, who's right? Is it high risk or is it low risk? Well, the auditor or the risk professional is probably looking at it from an inherent risk. And they're right. It's probably a high risk. The manager views it from a residual risk because they're only concerned with what they haven't mitigated. And so again, adding some of those descriptor words to it, I think start to help people to understand. So instead the conversation can go, hey, if your controls aren't working, this is a high risk to the organization. And so we're just going to come in and audit or check to make sure the controls are working right, so that and help provide assurance to you that the amount of risk that's left over is what you think it is. And if it's not, then we'll try to have some discussions about how you could improve that or other things like that, because the manager wants to know that too. They put these controls in place, and if they're not working, they'd like to know that before something goes wrong, right?
Yes.
So I think putting some of those things in it also helps people to understand better too.
Okay, so we talk about there's all kinds of risk, right? And so a common misunderstanding is we should mitigate all risks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what we should be doing, Jason?
I think that's what a lot of risk professionals think, right? Because it's like they want to try to, and if you think about, so even just personality wise, okay, most of the people that are drawn to this profession are usually risk averse people. Okay, and because
wait a minute, that doesn't make any. Well, no, I guess that makes sense.
It does make sense, right? Because
Yeah.
because they're trying to,
Right.
if you think about, because I know like a lot of times when I'll do training, I'll just do kind of a fun thing where it's like, all right, everybody, let's talk about risk, right? How many of you would jump out of an airplane in a parachute, right? And raise up your hand. And if I'm talking to a group of people that are in kind of this risk space, there's usually only one or two hands besides mine that go up, right? Because most of the people in that group are like, oh no, I'm not going to jump out of a plane. That's kind of a risky thing, right? Well, it is if you don't go through the process, right? I mean, I haven't done it yet, but it's on my bucket list. And the first time I jump out of an airplane, I'm not going to go pack my own chute and just jump out of the plane willy-nilly, right? I'm going to go to a professional place that does jumps for a living. I'm going to, go on a tandem jump with an expert that's packed the pack professionally, right? So I'm still taking some actions to be able to do that. But yes, am I taking on a risk jumping out of the airplane? Of course, right? But it's the exhilaration, it's that reward after you've tried to manage those risks, right? That ends up, that's where the trade-off ends up coming in. And so, I mean, really, and this is, again, like I said, where as risk professionals, we probably just need to start thinking a little different. Everything we do has some component of risk to it. And we may not realize it, but just getting out of bed in the morning has a risk. I mean, anything can happen in the morning, right? And so we are taking on risk all the time. And the issue is we have to manage risk to an acceptable level. That's one of the terms that a lot of people throw out there. And so again, you can go back to appetite and tolerance and some of these other terms that people usually use to define it. But we have to also realize that our organization and the managers that we're helping, they probably have a different risk tolerance or profile than what we do. And especially if you're working in an organization that is trying to do big things, right? They're probably taking bigger risks because there is that direct correlation between the risk you're willing to take on and the reward that you're willing or that you're going to get as well. Now, it's not always, because there's risk adjusted stuff that comes out of this, but the reality is you can't reduce risk to zero. If you do, then your business probably shouldn't exist. You should just, sell off, close down everything, and just invest the owner's money in treasury bonds, because that's taken on zero risk. But, nobody, I don't think anybody in their right mind would go to their CEO and say, hey, we need to just shut down the business. Let's just put it in the bank.
Right.
But sometimes I think to the executives, it feels like that's what we're asking them to do.
I guess it goes back to they always say high risk, high reward,
Mhm.
right? So if you go down, to zero risk, what's,
What's your
are you optimally, performing, right? Is you can't be no risk, but then how do you compete in the market and, things like that, right?
Yeah. And for risk professionals, it is important for us to know what level of risk the organization wants to take on. And so that's where some of these risk statements and appetite statements and other things like that the board is supposed to be providing to management on, hey, I want this kind of return. I'm willing for you to take on this kind of risk, but I don't want you to take on that kind of risk. And so that's where, again, the risk professionals can come in and say, is management actually taking on the level of risk the board wants them to take on? Right. And so, like, a simple example could be maybe the board says, hey, we want to grow internationally by 20% next year, but we don't want to be in these certain countries, or we don't want to be in these certain industries or something like that. And so then, again, you can say, well, let's see if now management is actually doing what they're asked to do in order to be able to get that level of return.
What's your opinion on, as risk professionals, they have insight that the board may not have, or the management may not have. So what's your perspective on risk professionals kind of making recommendations or suggestions? The board, everything can be pushed down,
Mm-hmm.
but risk professionals, thinks that's not appropriate or not right. Do you feel like risk professionals are kind of taking more in an advisory role, an expert role? Should they be doing more? Should they be doing less? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, so some of that's probably going to depend on your organization itself, right? So some of the organizations, I mean, the utopia would be that the risk professional is providing advice and insight. Now, that's where we have to remember, though, we're just providing advice and insight. We're not the ones making the end decision. And so we also have to be willing to provide the advice and then let the people who it's their job to make the decision actually make the decision. Okay. And sometimes they're going to be, sometimes they're right. Sometimes we're right. Okay. And the only way is, by actually doing this. And the more you do this, the more you can see, because there is a big value in someone who is outside of the day-to-day activities providing insight. Because most of the time when we're in the day-to-day activities, we can't see everything else that's going on. And so this is one of the things in risk management, is trying to, especially from a strategic level, figuring out what are some of the other things that we should be thinking about as we're making some of these decisions. Okay, so I'll give you an example from my career. At a time that we were buying a lot of natural gas in our production facilities, because we needed the gas to manufacture and do what we were doing. And so it was at a time when oil prices were going up, which meant natural gas prices were going up. And so some of the operations managers in our organization were scared about where the price was actually going to go to. And so in that situation, it's a commodity. You can hedge that commodity. And so what had happened was, we had budgeted, I think, might get the numbers wrong, but $5 an MMBTU was our budget for the year. And the operations managers got approached by a marketing company that said, I'll sell you a hedge for the remaining open position, right, on your gas hedges at $4.50 an MMBTU. So the managers went, oh, hey, this is good. If we sign this contract and lock in 100% of what we're doing, then we are 50 cents ahead on our budget, right? Looks good for me and for my bonus at the end of the year. And so they were pushing to do that. And there were only two. We had this, it was a committee meeting where we were talking about our open positions for all of our commodities. And again, they brought that forward, and myself and one other individual said, I don't think that's the right decision to do. And here's why. Right. Like the one man, he'd spent his whole career in this industry. And he said, I remember him saying some comment like, the long term, 20-year price of gas is X. And even though we're in a short term cyclical nature, the gas prices are going to come down. I've seen this several times in my career, and it's going to happen. We would be foolish to try to lock in for a period of 1 year where we think it's going to be coming down. And I looked at it, and said, anytime you have a hedging strategy, you never want to hedge 100%. Because if you're hedging 100%, then you're not really hedging. And in fact, a lot of companies have gotten in trouble by hedging more than 50 or 60% because then they get locked in. And so that's what they were proposing that we did. Now, both of us put forth that advice and that insight from our different perspectives. Now, at the end of the day, what decision do you think they made, Andrea?
Oh, let me guess.
Yeah, they're like, well, no, we're going to hedge everything, right? So
Right.
they hedged everything. Sure enough, by the end of the year, the price had come back down. If we had not hedged, right, we lost effectively millions of dollars because we hedged more than we should have. Okay, so that was an example where, hey, these two crazy individuals happen to be right. So if we have that discussion again, right, then hopefully everybody else is going to go, oh yeah, last time you guys had a good point. Maybe we should listen to you, right? But it could go the other way around, right? I mean, we could be completely wrong ourselves. And so I think as risk professionals, we have to be mature enough, if you will, to admit that maybe we don't have all of the insight, or maybe we don't have all of the experience and knowledge that some of the managers do as well. And so, yes, we can provide insight, but I sometimes feel that risk professionals think they have more insight than they actually do. And so we just have to kind of check ourselves a little bit on that, which again is hard for the ego.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, well, no, I've been taught, how to do this and how to look at all this stuff. And it's like, well, but did you consider this? Ooh,
Right.
No, I didn't. And so it's having those communications, trusting each other, and actually trying to talk things through that I think risk professionals do add the value, but it has to be a two-way street. That's where, again, like we said before, I think, some people in the organization don't value risk management because they feel like risk is telling them how they have to run the business.
Right.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a Riskonnect podcast by subscribing to our newsletter at www.riskkonnect.com. Now, back to the show.
That's great. When you were talking, you talked about different categories and levels of risk, that at the board level, they talk strategic risk, and, risk professionals probably a lot of times are kind of, dealing with day to day, and it's operational. So the common misunderstanding about risk is there's only one kind of risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think it's funny because we've talked before, just you and I kind of off air, if you will, about kind of the history behind risk management. Okay. And a lot of what people refer to as risk management now really came out of financial services, and it really created kind of the whole insurance industry. Hey, if something goes wrong, how can I make sure that, this bet that I did doesn't put me out of business, as an example, right? So insurance companies started getting developed, and this goes clear back to the Middle Ages, when people started doing some of the big trade routes and other things like that. I mean, you send a ship around the world for 2 years, and you're an owner investing in that ship, you hope to heck it comes back. But if it doesn't, you'd like to get some return on your money. And so that's where, again, insurance kind of comes in, right?
Right.
And over a big view of risk and things like that. So like life insurance is a great example. If I'm insuring 1 million people, I'm going to calculate expected mortality rates, right? So I can guess mathematically kind of when most people are going to die. Okay, not to be too morbid, but it's a great.
No. I'm not telling you how old I am now.
Well, I won't tell you either. How about that? But it's in that sort of a situation with big numbers, you can come up with some pretty good estimates, right? I mean, they may misestimate when I'm gonna die, but they get me wrong, but they got somebody else wrong too, and that just happens to net out in the wash, as an example. And so that was really where a lot of people in risk management were kind of trained. And so they always view it as, if I've got these big numbers, and a lot of people like to call portfolio view of risk. And yes, if you're dealing with a large portfolio like that, then a lot of the mathematical applications and things can work out pretty easily. And it's the same thing. Like if I were to go to a casino and play roulette, okay, roulette is a mathematically calculated game. If you played 1 million hands of roulette, it wouldn't matter how you bet. If you put it on black every single time, or you put it on the number 24 every time, it doesn't matter, because after 1 million hands, you have the same amount of money, because mathematically it ends up working out. You lose 2 cents for every dollar you spent, because that's the house's take. Okay. But the issue is, we're not playing 1 million hands with most of these things, right? We're only going in and playing 20 rounds of roulette. And so it does matter the strategies that we take at that point. And so we have to kind of switch from just that classical financial exposure, insurance, risk management kind of focus, to being broader into thinking about doing things in a different way, because that's really how the world works in general. And so, that's why even using terms like managing risk instead of risk management might be a good way of trying to explain it. I know we've talked about that a little bit before, right? Is that, if we start thinking about, I'm trying to manage risk instead of I'm doing risk management, which is usually, like I said, seen as being, insurance, financial service, crunch the number kind of a basis. And what's interesting is, well, here's an example actually that just kind of happened that I was thinking about is, I live in California. And for the last 2 years, we've had some pretty bad wildfires in Northern California. I mean, it was just decimated a couple of years ago. And PGE, which is the local utility company up in Northern California, just finally settled for $1 billion. Okay, that's a big number. 1 billion with a B, right? And what did they settle for? Well, some of their equipment actually started some of those fires. Okay. And so they were held liable. Like the city of Paradise was completely, like 20,000 person town, just completely leveled. Now, did PGE have risk? Obviously, because they just had to pay $1 billion for this.
Yeah.
Now, could they have just mathematically calculated, what the expected loss is, blah, 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 blah? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I haven't talked to anybody in the risk department there. So, but you have to expect that as an electric utility company, we know that is sometimes the cause of fires, sparks, other things like that from their equipment that can lead to fire damage. Now, could they accurately predict that 2 years ago was going to be the year that they got hit with this? Probably not, right? But should they be doing things to try to manage those risks along the way? Absolutely. Right. And what's interesting, because I live in Southern California, and so our local utility down here, I've noticed billboards on the side of the highway that say never release Mylar balloons. Right. You know, those little the metallic-y balloons with helium, never let those go, because what ends up happening is if those go up and hit the power line, it causes an arc and ends up sending sparks everywhere. Now, I just started seeing that probably this last year. And I remember having the thought as I'm driving, that's kind of an interesting thing to spend advertisement on. There must have been something that happened that led that local utility to say, hold it, maybe we should put some ads out there. And it was probably, again, some of the stuff from Northern California the year earlier.
Right.
Now, by putting a billboard up on the side of the street, does that mean if, SoCal Edison, which is a big one in Southern California, if something happens and they caused wildfires like that, do you think it's going to get them off the hook completely? No.
Right.
Right. But at least they're showing some good faith on trying to avoid some of that stuff. Now, those kind of risks, you can't just calculate like you do life insurance.
Right. Hey, I mean, when the Notre Dame fire happened, what was your first reaction? How do you, the damage that you can't recover history.
You can't recover history. Yeah, it's gone. And so, again, we're talking about risk as the effect. How do you measure the effect of Notre Dame burning?
Yeah.
There's some ways that you can try to calculate it, and you have, and this is where it's risk management is an art and science, right? Because you don't know exactly, but you try to make your best guess on what you think. Is this $1 billion thing, or is this $100,000 thing?
Right.
And if you think it's closer to $1 billion, then you probably should spend some time and effort trying to fix it. But, again, sometimes these things come from places that we're not expecting, because maybe we've never seen it before. But that's where the communication and everything really kind of comes in. And this is where, again, kind of from these different categories of risk, a lot of people in their risk professionals focus on more kind of the operational or financial statement-ish risks. Okay. That's not what the board and the executives are worried about. Okay, yes, they want to make sure that you don't have a material deficiency on your SOX report and blah, 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 right? But that's not what they're thinking about all the time. And so where I see too that one of the big misconceptions and miscommunication, sometimes argument comes in, is there's different levels of risk within an organization. There's stuff up at the strategic level that your board and your senior executives are worried about. Those are the things that they're creating objectives and strategic plans on to try to meet those things. Now, you've got all kinds of processes and operational things that you're doing to try to meet that, right? But that's not what they're primarily concerned with. And so, I say this to a lot of people, that operational risk, which is where most people focus, is actually risks that you are causing by the way you choose to do business.
That's a pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? What
profound,
you're saying.
wise.
Is it controversial? Is like what I mean?
It is a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Because again, I think people think, well, what do you mean, right?
I'm causing this.
That can't be I'm causing this, but
right.
Yeah, most of the time it is, right? Because
we might have to have a whole podcast on that one.
Well, yeah, and we can, right? Because it's I think that's again one of those things to get people to start thinking differently is the way you choose to do things can actually increase your risk. Or you choose to take one strategic approach, which means you operationalize it this way, which
Yeah.
means now all of a sudden you have all these other risks that you have to deal with. And sometimes the problem is if those impacts are not like hardcore, um, financially calculatable, then a lot of people think, well, they don't really exist.
Right.
And so, as an example, let's take. I mean, you can see this a lot with, privacy or some of these other things where companies continue to try to control, add more and more and more and more stuff to what you have to do. Now, what a lot of times that ends up doing is it causes some backlash with their customers that they don't actually realize. Okay.
Yeah.
And so again, you can take, there's the old story about Nordstrom, the retailer,
Yeah.
that, well, they'll accept anything
Yeah.
back as a return. It doesn't matter. I mean, they've done some like really crazy research on this where like somebody will roll 4 tires into
Yeah.
a Nordstrom and say, I'd like a refund. Nordstrom doesn't sell tires. Okay. So they know they didn't sell that
Right.
to the people, right? But they've
Right.
taken a business decision to say, look, I don't care. I want that person to be happy because I'm going to give them a refund. And what do you think they're going to use it on? Because I'm going to give them a store credit,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're still going to pay. They're still going to pay it. Now you have to dispose of the tires. You have to figure out what to do, right? But that's a minor cost of operations to keep the customer happy and to keep them buying and using your products and services.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, again, a lot of times in companies attempt to what I consider over mitigate or over control some of these things, they're actually pissing their customers off. And that means that people are not going to do business with them. Right. And so I had an example with this with a bank. I was working with my mother-in-law. We had to do some financing stuff on her house. And the bank that she uses, I will never use personally. And as soon as we sell her house, we will not be using that bank again. And this is one of the largest banks in the world, but the hoops that we had to jump through and all of the work and the back and the forth and the everything else, it was a nasty customer experience for us.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure people at the bank are thinking, well, no, I'm managing the risks, so nothing bad ever happens. Well,
Right.
guess what? In your attempt to manage and make sure nothing bad ever happens, we're not going to use you anymore.
True. Yeah. That's
So
another good thing to think about is managing risk enough to cover the company, but not to alienate your customer base.
yeah. Well, and I think too,
I've been in a situation like that, and I'd say, do you want the name of my firstborn as well? Like, that's what I think. You're trying to cover so many different parts of your risk that, I just felt like I will hand over my firstborn because that's about the only thing you haven't asked me.
mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we have to be careful of that. And I think, kind of maybe the last thing on this level and categories of risks is, I see a lot of times risk professionals are saying, look, people are ignoring me. They don't think I'm adding value, right? And so, again, one of those things that I say that a lot of times people don't want to hear is if people are ignoring you, you're probably focusing on the wrong things. And so if you want the respect and the admiration and the to be seen as an authority in your organization on risk management with your executives and board, then you better be talking to them about things that they actually care about. And if you're coming in with some little, oh, hey, we found that, we aren't managing this risk and we can save the company $25,000 or $100,000 by changing this, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. It's like, I've got a $25 million revenue shortfall to try to make up for. That's what I'm concerned about, right? Help me fix that. I don't care about that other thing. And so if you want to be taken more seriously, you have to start elevating yourself up and start talking about things at that higher strategic level. And I think also too, it's because, sometimes as we're talking with different people, if they're down at an operational or process level talking about risk, you're going to be talking about it completely different than you would at the strategic level. And so those two people have a hard time communicating because they understand risk, or where their focus is completely different.
You had mentioned talking about the topic of risk management, adding value. You mentioned the 2019, the State of Risk Oversight from NC State and AICPA. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is one where I found it interesting. Yeah, it came out a few months ago, and as I read through it, it was I guess I kind of felt a little sad in some ways, but not surprised in others. And so let me just kind of throw some of the things out there that kind of goes along to this, right? That there's this whole give and take kind of pull on this as well. So about 60% of external parties are putting pressure on senior executives to do more about risk management, right? So there's pressure coming from the outside to do more about risk. 65% of boards are calling for somewhat to extensively increased management of risk. So the board's saying it to senior management as well. So they're hearing it from the outside. But less than 20% of organizations view their risk management process as providing important strategic advantage. So only 20%. That means 80% of executives think it's not worth doing. It's not helping me in my strategy. And again, maybe that's some of that discussion that we were just having about, if you're focused down in the details, they expect you to be up in the strategy if you're going to actually be adding value.
Right.
And the fact that, like, one of the biggest things for organizations not doing more in risk management is that they believe the benefits of risk management do not exceed the cost.
Wow.
That's our risk reward discussion we had before, right?
Yes.
And so, again, to me, a little sad, because it feels like a lot of executives are feeling that risk management is another thing they have to comply with, instead of it being something that can be a strategic advantage. And I totally get it, right? I mean, if they see risk as something else they have to comply with, then they're not going to want to spend any time or effort on it. Just check the box and let's move on.
Yeah.
But if that's what risk management is to your organization, then, that's kind of where you're stuck. If you're wanting to do all these nice other things, and again, maybe it's, we need to look at ourselves in the mirror, like you said before, right? Yeah. Maybe we're part of the cause of that.
Yeah.
Is because if we're focusing on the wrong areas, if we're not talking about the right things, if we can't make the business case for what we're doing, and kind of sell that like any other project and be able to show the return on that, then of course they're not going to want to give us the money. They're not going to want to give you the time. They're not going to want to talk to you, because they don't feel like what you're doing is actually adding value.
We hear that a lot. Our customers, last year we kind of did a survey on, what's important to you. And one of the things was, being more strategic to the organization, not being here comes risk again, making more work for me, or, telling me what to do. And I think everybody wants to move in that direction. It's the challenge of how. And I think you've given some great things to think about, is to think about the words that you're using. Think about, what's important to the management team and the board, and, just interacting more and collaborating more, so that what it is top of mind, so that you can talk and walk the walk.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we could talk again for like a whole nother segment of time about trying to provide the business case, because again, I think a lot of times we fail to realize people make emotional decisions.
Yeah.
That's human nature. 80 to 90% of all the decisions that you make every day are based on emotion, not based on data or facts. We choose to find data to support what we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the biggest keys for people to be able to, show and prove the business case is to tie it back to some emotional trigger that the board or the executives have. All right. Like I said before, if you're over here like, hey, I just saved the company $100,000, I'm feeling great about myself. Right. And this executive's going, I don't know how I'm going to make up this $25 million revenue loss. There's always going to be that disconnect. Right. And so if what you're doing can help them overcome that revenue shortfall, they're going to be listening to you all day. What you can, how much, if I invest $100,000, you can help me get the 25 million. They're going to listen to you at that point.
Right.
Right. But we have to kind of change our perspective, change the way we're talking. Probably need to listen more than we're talking. Right. That's why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Yeah. Well, this has really been great, Jason. For those of you that have been listening in, thank you so much. There'll be more sessions, more podcasts about topics that are of interest to risk professionals all over the world. You can reach Jason at meffordassociates.com. If there are things you want us to talk about, certainly contact me at andrea.brody@riskonnect.com. And Jason, again, thank you so much for your time, and we'll look forward to the next podcast.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Please be sure to visit our website, www.riskonnect.com, to subscribe to our newsletter, get information about future podcasts, and find other insights about managing risk and compliance effectively.